My name is 𝙒𝙧𝙧𝙠𝙨. I am the treasurer, co-founder of PA Lyme, and we're looking forward to spending some time with you tonight. What you should see on the cover here is, as we said, having Nicole be our presenter tonight. In putting tonight's presentation together, we got information from Nicole, and she shared a paragraph or two on what tonight's presentation would be. I was struck at the very first sentence, and I'll just read it to you if I may. Chronic illness often results in not one, but two patients, the person ill and the person caring for them. And when I look at it and I look at the journey that I've been through, you know, it's pretty easy to focus on yourself if you have chronic Lyme and you're going through the journey. But those around you that are caregivers, they're going on the same journey, just from a slightly different perspective. As we were working on this, and I realized, yeah, this really is for patients and for caregivers. So what I'm going to suggest is, this is going to be on our website, palyme.org. And if you yourself are going through the chronic Lyme journey or chronic illness journey, this might be a presentation you want to share with your spouse, your parents, anyone else that was a caregiver, and see if they can't get productive tools. So for those that are patients, acquiring the tools to survive the complexity of Lyme disease. And then for the caregivers, how do you provide care without losing yourself? And as we were talking about this about a week ago, in having the conversation with Nicole, I had mentioned, and I have it right here, hopefully you can see that, I'll put it a little closer. This was in the New York Times Sunday, just this past Sunday. And it was an article with the heading, How I Became Extremely Open-Minded. And I mentioned to Nicole, it really caught my attention, just that title, because I read it and I said, well, I've become open-minded, but it took a hell of a journey through Lyme disease to get there. And it's been 8 years trying to get to the point of, you know, looking at Lyme and trying to recognize that you can get benefits like open-mindedness. So for my process, what I recognize in talking to people over the last couple of weeks about this is, as you're viewing this, it really depends on what stage of the process you're in. The Lyme journey really does reflect the same grieving process that somebody that loses a loved one that they go through, that there's stages. There's denial initially, then there's anger, and then there's bargaining, and then there's depression, and then there's acceptance. And that journey can happen slowly or quickly, and it takes really quite a while for a lot of people. And folks get through their journey at different rates at different times. So it's a very personal journey. And as we were looking at this and looking at the article that this individual wrote, the benefit that he got of becoming extremely open-minded was because of his Lyme journey. He talks about 5 years of going through, you know, the misdiagnosis, the mistreatment, the confusion, all of the things that we go through within the Lyme community. And he talks about how it really is important to start being an advocate for yourself. And in doing so, you have to think outside the box and alternative things to look at, looking for different strategies. And that process really doesn't happen when you're in the first couple of stages of your process. So if you're in denial, if you're in anger, certainly depression, it's very, very challenging to look at Lyme and say, well, how did I get anything meaningful out of this? But that is the skill that you will want to take on for yourself and kind of think, how quickly Can I go through that process? How fast can I make it through and get to acceptance of where I'm at? Doesn't mean you like it. Doesn't mean it's what you wish for. It's certainly nothing you would wish on, someone you don't like, but it's where you're at. And given that it's where you're at, for those people that have chronic Lyme, when they can start looking at where they're at and start to recognize, how am I different? How am I better? How am I stronger? What has Lyme provided me that maybe I would not have gotten there on my own? Am I more compassionate? Do I value friends and family more? Are you more open to exploring, looking for enhancements and improvements, looking for positive results? So for the folks that recognize that where you are on your Lyme journey, that as you get through it, you start getting an epiphany. The cloud will lift. You're no longer in that fight and flight mode of just reacting because you're denying, you're angry, and you're depressed. But now you get to a clearing. And in that clearing, you can start looking at what things have helped to improve me. Is it meditation? Are you learning skills of nutrition and exercise? Are you a better person? And not everyone goes through this journey. I will share with you, with PA Lyme, every person on the board, and Bill Moore is on the call with us tonight. He's a director of information technology. He runs Pittsburgh Lyme. What I'm speaking of is the process that he and 17 other regional leaders have gone through, and board members, that they're now looking at this experience through the lens of, how can it make me stronger? For someone that has acute Lyme, there may not be enough time that you're associated and dancing with Lyme disease to really get through this. But for the people that have really been beaten down and keep working to get more improvement, this is something that really can resonate. So as I suggest all of that, what I'm going to leave with before I introduce Nicole is, this will be on our website, palyme.org. I'd encourage you to look at the opening, to view the whole thing again, and challenge yourself and say, well, okay, I heard it from that guy in that opening. Acceptance is where I want to get to. How do I do that? And that's where you will want to reach out to other people that are going through the same journey. And that's why our support groups are so valuable. On our website, you can find, all through Pennsylvania, 18 regional leaders that are there if you have questions or comments, and please find them on palyme.org. So with that, just by way of opening, I do want to turn it over to Nicole, and I want to give a little bit of background that I was really intrigued with the book, with the Dr. Chris Turnpaul here in the Mechanicsburg, Pennsylvania area, being one of the individuals that was giving comment and discussing the book. It really opened our eyes to, what was her background and what was the perspective that Nicole was coming from. So by way of introduction, Nicole has a bachelor's and a master's of science in materials science and engineering from MIT. She also has a master's of science in biomedical engineering from Duke. So as an engineer and an executive, she's got 15 years experience in the medical devices, medical technology field. So she's a team leader, a project leader. She leads surgical teams of robotics. She's coming at her medical approach of a profession from that thought process of an engineer. Things all changed when her husband was diagnosed with Lyme and became critically ill. That's when her most important and challenging role really was presented to her. The role of caregiver, and maybe as important, medical proxy. People aren't out there doing this for us. We have to do it for ourselves, or have someone who loves us to really kind of fight the battles, to go through the ropes that a lot of us go through. And so she details this journey in her memoir, What Lurks in the Woods. and she's seeking to help others navigate chronic conditions. And when we were talking with her last week, the attribute of somebody writing a novel to try to help others to not go through what they did, to help them with their journey, I mean, our hearts go out to those individuals. So she is an author, she's an entrepreneur, she's an advocate for tick-borne and neurodegenerative diseases. So with that, Nicole, I'm going to turn it over to you. We're really tickled pink to have you. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much, Eric, for having me. Let me share my screen. Okay. Can you all see? Okay. Yep.
Yes.
Okay. So thank you so much for having me. Thank you everyone on the call for spending some of your Tuesday night, here to listen to us and to me speak. I wanted to take you on a journey. As Eric said, Lyme is definitely a journey. And so I wanted to share ours and what we learned along the way. So I'll start with, who we are and where we started, and then what we encountered. Every Lyme journey is interesting and unique. But I wanted to focus most of all about what I learned as a caregiver. That is a very challenging role. It's one that most people, just like with illness and patients, you're thrown into it. Well, caregiver roles you're thrown into too. And as you go through it, you have to figure out how to respond and how to react. And there were a lot of hard-learned lessons that now I want to share with others in the hopes that maybe it helps you in your journey. And then finally, just end with kind of where to go from here and some of the key takeaways. So in terms of who we are and background, my background, I grew up in Massachusetts. As Eric mentioned, my education is at both MIT and Duke. I've been an engineer my entire career, and so I kind of have a love of solving problems and have developed a real passion for root cause engineering that I've then taken into our Lyme journey. I started in Boston and then moved to California for a couple of years, and now I'm settled with my family in Raleigh, North Carolina. I've been here since 2006. And my career is, I guess, kind of two phases. The first part of my career, I spent all in the electronics and semiconductor industry. And then around mid-career was when I went back to Duke to get the biomedical engineering degree, and that's when I got into medical devices. And my entire career, I've been running high technology, really complex systems, and running lots of projects. My last role was in a robotic surgical company, and I ran all the new product development. So just done a lot of project management and a lot of kind of complex programs managing through from beginning to end. And then there's my husband, Russ. So Russ is also an engineer. He was someone that I met actually in my first startup about a year or so out of college. And I didn't expect to fall in love with him. He was older than I am, and just didn't immediately seek as a fit. But then over time, as we spend a lot of time together, I really just fell in love with his charm and his humor and all the things about him. He was exceedingly smart. He was also an engineer in electrical and computer science engineering. There's a picture there of, he's got 24 patents and all sorts of different technologies and communications and electronics. He was a world-class guitarist and played, actually toured with the Doobie Brothers for a little while in his younger days. And he was a big outdoorsman. He liked everything: hunting, skiing, fishing, shooting, mountain biking, just had a love of life, and was also just super funny. And was a great dad to our two kids, Ryan and Haley, who, when we moved to North Carolina, we started our family. And so it seemed like everything was going great. I was doing perfectly in my career. Russ had stepped back from his high-powered role to kind of be Mr. Mom and help support the family, so that he used to tell me, oh, it's your time to shine and to do your career. And it seemed like everything was going great. But then things started to change. Over time, Russ became moody. He became irritable. He became nasty at many times. He was depressed. And, I chalked it off to so many different things. We had a lot of lifestyle changes. He had retired. He was always a very, great executive, and he was missing that in his life when he stepped back and kind of went into early retirement. So I figured maybe he was unfulfilled. We also had 2 young children. So that adds a lot of stress to a relationship and to a family. And so I was like, well, maybe he's just not happy with that move. But then eventually I realized it was more than that. You know, his symptoms got more severe. And then in 2016, I realized that he was forgetting things. He would forget the code for our house alarm, and he would constantly be triggering our security system. He would forget the time to pick up the kids after school, even though it was the same time every day. And he was constantly losing things. And this was a very intelligent, super organized man. And so I finally put the pieces together and realized that we had a really serious issue at hand. It wasn't just unhappiness. This was a serious problem. And so we, reached out to doctors, and in 2016, our journey with chronic illness began. So, the medical system is really interesting, and you have a lot of interesting encounters along the way. And so our journey was no different. Right away, I knew that I didn't want to go to traditional medicine. I knew that I was really into holistic health, and I wanted to do a more integrative approach. And I knew that just 15 minutes, like with a primary care physician, wasn't enough. And so we started right off the bat with an integrative practitioner. And my first thought in our first appointment, I spent a lot of time preparing, and I wrote a detailed email. And my first thought was Lyme disease. I had done some research on causes of cognitive function issues and brain fog, and Lyme disease came up in my research, and it just made a lot of sense. Russ was a hunter. He was constantly in the woods. He did all of the landscaping on our property. I had pulled many ticks off of him over the course of our relationship, and he had lived all over the country, not only in North Carolina and New Hampshire, but also New Jersey, Texas. He had lived in California, all over the country. So many areas that are known to be endemic with different types of tick-borne illnesses. And so that was my first thought. The other thing that I was thinking of was heavy metals. I had learned a lot about heavy metal poisoning and lead in some of the research with cognitive function. And Russ was a big shooter, and he liked to do a lot of the reloading for shotguns, and that exposed him to a lot of lead. And so those were my first 2 thoughts. And we went to an integrative practitioner. She ran a whole series of labs. And her assessment at the end of the day was that all of his labs were normal. He was tested with a Western blot, and he only tested positive for 1 of the necessary 5 bands. So she said he was negative for Lyme disease. And she ran a whole other array of tests for heavy metals, and it was elevated, but not too bad. And everything else looked okay. So she said, if you still think that there's a problem, then you should go and see a neurologist. And so that's what we did. And at the end of 2016, beginning of 2017, we saw a series of neurologists, and he underwent some cognitive testing. And that was when I realized the extent of the problem. He was really failing and doing terribly at simple exercises that were doing pattern matching and spatial recognition. I realized, and given that he was an engineer and had done all of this for a career, I realized how bad that his condition had become. And because he wasn't working at the time, he had really masked it quite effectively. And then in January of 2017, I got a big baseball bat to the head when we received the diagnosis of early onset Alzheimer's disease. And the PET scan, that the radiologist classified his decline as late stage disease. So our first diagnosis, and he was already classified as being in late stage disease. And I was floored. I couldn't believe it. He was 60 years old at the time, and it just didn't make any sense. He had no genetic markers associated with Alzheimer's disease and early onset. I tested him with the most extensive panel that I could find, and all of it was negative. He had no comorbidities that were increasing his risk of Alzheimer's, and no lifestyle factors that would also, lead him to be down the path of Alzheimer's. All of the things that you read about that say, do this for brain health, eat a Mediterranean diet, exercise, cardiovascular health, all of it. He was doing it. And still we had this crushing diagnosis. And so I searched for other answers. I kept researching. I had him tested for everything that I could think of and find on the internet that could be a cause of his disease. And test after test after test came back negative. And, at our 4th neurologist, who was the leading neurologist in the Raleigh-Durham area, I'd been referred to him by multiple other doctors. We were in his office, and Russ had left because he was really frustrated. And I begged the doctor. I said, doctor, there has to be a reason that this is happening. Like, there has to be a root cause. And he just looked at me and he said, you know what, Mrs. Bell, I'm sorry, but I won't swear. He did, but I won't. He said, you know, blank happens. And I still, every time I say that, the crushing feeling in my stomach comes back, because I remember thinking, oh my gosh, like all of your years of medical training and the best that you have to offer me is, you know, this happens. I couldn't believe it. And so that was the point where I pretty much gave up and I started planning for the eventual decline that was to come. But just a few short months later, I received a phone call from my brother, and it had also been dealing with health issues in his family. His wife had been sick for years and had been from doctor to doctor to doctor, trying to figure out what was going on with her. And they had finally figured out that the cause was Lyme disease and 3 co-infections. And my brother's a doctor, and he started engrossing himself in the research. And he became convinced that Lyme was also the root of Russ's decline. And I said, I know, I mean, that was my first thought. And I had him tested and he was negative. And, then we talked about how bad the tests are and how the Western blot looks for antibodies. And if your immune system is suppressed, then you're not going to test positive because your immune system may not be making enough antibodies to trigger the test. And so he convinced me to go to a specialty lab and trust him with the direct testing methodology with PCR. And with that test, he tested positive to Borrelia burgdorferi and Bartonella 𝙒𝙗. And then later, after we found a Lyme literate physician, he also tested positive for 𝗬𝙗𝙤 𝙤𝙬𝙁. And so 15 months after we started this whole escapade, we finally figured out the root cause of his decline. And actually, the Lyme literate physician also figured out that heavy metals, my second, thing on his list, was also a big issue in his decline. And he had very elevated levels of lead and mercury in his blood. So, it was devastating, but at least we had our answers. And so we went through treatment. We're like, okay, this is a lot better than Alzheimer's. We can go after it. We can treat it. And so we treated for 18 months with a broad course of antibiotics, both oral and IV. We treated with herbal therapies, with immune modulators. I mean, there were lots of different therapies. We saw several different doctors, and there were lots of ups and downs. There were many times when we had hope. I mean, he started getting better and a lot of his symptoms and aches and pains went away. But unfortunately, the cognitive decline, we just couldn't get ahead of it. I mean, his disease at the time we began treatment was entrenched, and we couldn't pull him out of it. And so by May of 2019, he was requiring full-time care. He was having all sorts of symptoms, and it was very difficult to manage him at home, as well as 2 young children. My kids were 5 and 8 at the time. And so in May, I made the decision to move him to a resident care facility. And he's been there ever since, and he's continued to decline as in the final stages of his disease. So, unfortunately, my story doesn't end well, which I know is hard to hear for a lot of people that are dealing with Lyme, because it's a tragic journey and you need that hope and that ray of light. And you also may be thinking, well, heck, this woman didn't cure her husband. Why should I listen to any advice she has to give on caregiving? But what I would say is that, our journey is extreme. I had 2 young children and a husband with very severe neuroborreliosis and other co-infections. And we caught it really late. But the extreme nature of that problem forced me to figure out how to be a better caregiver. It forced me, the fact that I was managing 2 young children, managing a dementia patient, managing the household, managing my job, all of the things, I had to figure out how to be a better caregiver with less effort and less time. I had to take all of my project management and engineering skills and say, how can I do this more efficiently? And how can I do this better? And just like with everything that you're thrown into, sometimes you fail and then you figure it out. And at the end of the day, I came up with, some systems and some techniques that really were helpful in giving care, and the doctors really responded to. And so I want to share that in the hopes that it resonates with you in your journey. And so the crux of what I'll talk about is, here's what I learned. What did I learn as a caregiver, and what do I do today now to manage my family? And I'll talk about a few different areas. The first is working with doctors, how to manage that relationship. Second is really staying organized. I mean, it's a hot mess of information, especially when you've been sick for years. And how do you manage that? And what tips and techniques can you use to, to keep everything in line? And then finally, and extremely importantly, is caring for yourself and making sure that you're not losing yourself along the way. So, I have to say, when I first started this whole medical journey, I was really passive and reactionary. You walk into the doctor's office and you expect them to drive the whole conversation. They're the experts, right? They know what to do. And you walk in, you answer their questions, and you expect them to figure out and solve your problem. But after a few months of this, I realized that that really wasn't the best approach. And as I thought about it, I realized, you know what? I'm the expert in this situation, because what's going on is the problem the doctor is trying to solve is what's going on with you or your loved one. They're trying to figure out what's going on. And even if you go to a functional medicine practitioner who spends an hour or two with you, it's really hard for them to figure out what's going on in an hour or two when you maybe haven't seen them in 4 to 6 weeks. So they have to understand 4 to 6 weeks of your life and your journey in an hour. And that's a really difficult task. And so, as a caregiver, I was the expert as to what was going on with Russ. I knew how he was responding to treatment and what he was doing. And so I started really thinking about that and figuring out, well, how can I take the knowledge that I have and make it easier for the doctor to do his job? And so I shifted the paradigm and instead of thinking of doctor as the white horse, the white knight on the big horse that was going to come in and solve all of our issues, I started thinking of doctors more as advisors and took a more active role in the process of managing Russ's treatment. And that's where I drew upon all of my experience in business and project management. I mean, that's kind of what I did and do for a living, is take complex problems and trying to figure out how to make them simpler. And that's looking at, how do I communicate better? How do I understand all the players on my team and the different, doctors and what they're bringing to the party? How do I live under the constraints of a budget? And how do I let the doctor know what that is so that we can work together to get the best possible outcome? How do I let them know what risks I'm willing to take and how experimental that I want to be in this treatment versus more traditional, and all the different things that you think about in business. It also can be relevant to caregiving. And so I started incorporating that into the way that I cared for Russ. So, and when you think about all the things that you have to do as a caregiver or as a patient, it's overwhelming, right? You have all the symptoms that you're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. You have piles and piles of lab results. You have stacks of medical records. I mean, especially if you've been at this for years, the amount of paperwork and the amount of stuff that you can encounter can be completely overwhelming. And so for me, staying organized was critical. It helped me help the doctor because I could help assemble and coalesce all the information in the best way possible. And then, okay. And then also, the other important thing was that it kept me sane, because, chronic illness is not something that you can control. As much as I would have liked to, I couldn't control his illness, but I could control how I reacted to it and how I managed it. And so staying organized and keeping all that information, in a way that could help the process was something that made me feel like I was actually accomplishing something. So the first thing was symptom tracking. His symptoms were pretty extreme. I mean, to say that they varied day by day would be an understatement. Some days they varied by the hour. I mean, we could be sitting there watching my son play baseball and he would be completely happy, and then something would trigger him and he would storm off, and I would be worried about him leaving and not being able to find him and wondering what I should watch, him or my 4-year-old who was playing at the playground. It was insanity. And I realized that I couldn't keep track of it all in my head, and I couldn't assemble all that information in real time. And so I needed a system and I needed a process that would help me do that. And so at first, I just started tracking symptoms on my computer, but that really wasn't real time enough. I realized that the hourly changes, I wanted to have something real time. And so finally, I ended up taking my phone and downloading an app to track his symptoms. And I used one called My Symptom Tracker. And I liked that it was really just kind of easy to use, and I could make my own symptoms and then rate them every day. And that's how I started. And then eventually I built upon that, and I kind of made a system around that whole process. And if I go through kind of the steps of that system, I'd say the first thing is establish a baseline. You know, where are you and what do you want to track? I would say the thing that I did was I kept it simple but sufficient. I would have about, 8 to 9 different symptoms that Russ was experiencing that I would track on a daily basis. I would rate those every day, and then I'd write in some notes. Anything that was, unusual, anything that I noted, any changes in treatment, and I would keep that in there. And I track his symptoms daily, and I write it down, and anything that I could think of that would have impact on his, his results and his mood and abilities. And then every few weeks I sat down and I'd search for trends. This was actually usually right before a doctor's appointment. I would sit down and I would say, okay, what are the trends? Were there any triggers? Were there any inflection points or changes? I mean, what was going on, and how can I try and mine this whole stack of information to see what's actually having an impact? And then finally, kind of re-baseline. Are the trends positive or negative? Did something change? If so, what was it related to? And how did that timing fit with other changes in his treatment? And then utilize that information to start to communicate to the doctor. One thing I would say here as a cautionary note is, especially if you're a caretaker, a caregiver, for somebody else, you're human too. And so your capabilities and your trends may impact your tracking. So one thing that I noticed over time is that, I sat down and I was like, oh, okay, in my more discerning times of the month, I was harsher in rating symptoms because I was cranky. Or when I didn't get enough sleep, I was harsher in treating symptoms. And so sometimes later on, I started tracking my own stuff as just in the notes field, just so I knew that when I was going back through that, maybe some of my harshness on his symptoms was related to me, because we're people too. We're not perfect, and we're not computers that do everything the same every time. And so you have to keep that in mind as you're tracking for someone else. So next is just the piles and piles of paperwork. I mean, chronic disease comes with chronic paperwork. And this is, here I'm just focusing on lab results and medical histories. I won't even go into the bills. I'm sure a lot of people can empathize with that. But, there was just so much stuff after, even just our few years of treatment. I had a lot of information I had to keep track of. And so, the first thing that I really tried to get a hold of was lab results. And this was actually something that I came across in some of the Alzheimer's reading I was doing. So I was reading a lot about tick-borne illness, and I was reading also about Alzheimer's. And I kind of hijacked a thought from Dr. 𝙒𝙧𝙧𝙠𝙪, which he has a cognoscopy, and he looks at all of the markers that are relevant to brain health. And then basically you track those and you look at those on a regular basis to see how you're doing and how it's impacting your health. And so I sat down and I looked at that, took it, and then realized this is something that can be really helpful in managing all the stacks of lab work that I have with Russ. And so I sat down with the doctor and we established a list of what, we would call a lot in project management, what are the metrics that matter, and what's the list of labs that we were going to track on a regular basis, and what was important to his particular case. And I had it all on a Google Sheets, folder. And I compared his results to the ideal results, not normal results. And I'll come back to that in a second, but the ideal results. What did we want his actual lab results to look like? And then every time I got a new lab result, I would go into the spreadsheet, I would update it. You could flag out of value ranges. You could monitor his progress. I would always record the last date of what he, when it was measured, so that when I sat down before an appointment, I could see if we needed to retest it at his next appointment. And it was all just there as a snapshot. That was really a good way of communicating with the doctor and also kind of tracking his progress through treatment. So, because I think most Lyme patients have probably heard this at one point or another, your labs are normal. I just wanted to take a minute to talk about that and say, well, what does that actually mean? And normal in most laboratory facilities is just based on reference ranges. A whole population of people come in and they get their lab test done. And then the laboratory establishes a bell curve of what the results look like. And then from that, they establish reference ranges. And that reference range is typically the 95% of the population falls within. So you have the 2.5% on one end and you have the 2.5% on the other end, and everything else is considered normal and gets flagged, get flagged as out of range if you're above that or below it. And the problem with that, there's many problems with that, but in some ways, biochemistry is not that simple, right? It varies by age, by weight, by gender, all sorts of things which aren't factored into play. And the other thing that you should think about is that in general, our population isn't well. 60% of adults have at least one chronic condition, 42% of adults are considered obese, 37% of adults have metabolic syndrome. So, normal is, to really be outside of that 95% of the population, you have to be in a pretty bad disease state. And so if you're monitoring and tracking those lab results, you don't want to look at normal, because that means that you're pretty far off on that particular metric. You want to look at what's optimal, and your doctor can help you just, understand what those optimal ranges are. And if your doctor doesn't know the difference between normal and optimal, then I would find a different doctor, because that's a very important part of functional medicine, and they can really help you tune in to get to a better health state. So the other key piece of keeping organized was medical history. And here, the one thing that I did was I kept a patient binder. So every time we would get a lab result from a doctor, I wouldn't rely upon them to keep it. I would ask them to send me an electronic copy, and I kept an electronic folder of everything that we had and had it organized so that I could find things easily. But I also printed out key lab results, and I kept a binder, which I took with me to all appointments. And if you're in the position where you're switching doctors or going to a new doctor, this binder is really important. And one thing that I learned, actually, Eric mentioned Dr. 𝙤𝙤𝙤𝙗, it was actually with Dr. 𝙤𝙤𝙤𝙗. He actually read my entire binder before the first appointment, and I realized that that was actually something that I could request of doctors. A lot of doctors will do this, especially in chronic illness, because they know how complicated it is. And you can ask them to bill it as a medical records review. And so it's a really good way to get a doctor up to speed and to kind of get that process going quickly, because sometimes that first new patient appointment can take several months to schedule, but if they can read your binder, bill it as a review, a lot of times that process goes quicker. So this is just below as an overview of the binder that I had. I had section 1 was a narrative of patient history. So the first, 20 minutes of every appointment, especially new appointments, is always, what's your patient, what's your family history and what have you been through? And so rather than go through that de novo every time, I decided to write it all up. And that way I had it and the doctor could readily access it, and I didn't have to think of it at the top of my head. Section 2 was new patient paperwork. This always you have to go and fill out. Oftentimes I would just take sections and say, see patient history. So I didn't have to fill it out constantly, but you do have to go through their forms, and I would keep copies of that just to be sure that I was meeting their needs. Section 3 was healthcare power of attorney. This is really important if you're taking care of somebody. In my case, the only way that I could get access to results. And so I had that for everything. Section 4 was lab tests, and I kept that summary right on the top as a way to just, track and monitor how things were going. And then any other relevant labs that I wanted specifics, I would put that underneath. Section 5 was doctor's office correspondence and summaries. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a coming slide. And then section 6 was finally supplement and treatment schedule. So kind of everything that he had been under, so I could keep that at the ready and at the go. So having that was a really useful tool, especially since some doctors tend to be more, some are more organized than others. And so having this always available was a really good tool for me. And so I guess putting that all together in terms of shifting that paradigm to being more active, how did it all come together? So regularly I would track symptoms with the app. And I would track labs with the spreadsheet. So anytime a new lab came in, I would enter it. And then anytime a new piece of information came in, I would update the folder with all of his records. And I'd kind of just do that on a regular basis. Then 2 to 3 days before a doctor's appointment, I would sit down and I'd review all of the symptoms, review all of the lab results. I'd search for trends, I'd search for themes, I'd look at what labs might need to be updated. And then I would sit down and I would actually write it out. I would write out a summary with a list of all of the things that we had seen over the past time period. For us, it was usually 4 to 6 weeks before we had seen the, since we had last seen the doctor. And I'd write kind of a bulleted summary of what that looked like and what I had learned, and then come in with a list of questions. And that was really helpful. And at first, when I did it with doctors, I was a little apprehensive because I had dealt with some traditional medicine doctors and they barely read anything that I had sent them. But when I did it with functional medicine doctors, they were really open and really thankful for the information in a format that they can digest, because they want to help and they don't know everything that you've been through. And so having it in a digestible format for them was really well appreciated. And so then at the appointment, we would basically my email would be the outline of what we would go through. We'd go through the summary, we'd go through the questions, determine any lab or supplement changes that needed to be done. And then the doctor would give his impressions and recommendations based upon what we had seen. And so I think it was a really, interesting inflection point and change for me to realize that, yes, I am the expert and I can be an active part of this process and help them, help us get better. And the other thing I guess I would say before I kind of close on working with doctors and summarize is that, I'm a big ruminator. As a caregiver, it is a hard freaking job. I mean, I know I haven't been a patient, so I can't speak to that. But as a caregiver, you're constantly questioning yourself. You're constantly doubting yourself. You're saying, oh, is he better? Is he worse? Is it good? Did I do this wrong? Could I have done this better? And there's just so much rumination that's going on in your head. And it can get to the point, at least for me, where it was really unhealthy. And so it was really helpful for me to turn that rumination into action, to do something that I felt was actually moving the ball forward and helping to make the process easier and make the process, go more smoothly. And so I would really encourage you to take that, I know you can look at this and say, oh my gosh, that's so much work and it takes so much time, but I know that you're spending a lot of time just thinking about it and fretting over things. And if you can take some of that energy and pour it into communicating better, into tracking better, then I think that you'll start feeling more control and start feeling a sense of connection with the doctor that will hopefully help. And then the last key piece, which absolutely cannot be missed, is caring for yourself. And, as I said before, there's some things that I did really well through this process, and there's some things that I did not so well. And this next one, asking for help, is something that I'm still working on in my journey. I definitely did not do this well. And I watched a friend whose wife suffered with another debilitating neurodegenerative disease. And I watched him do it completely opposite of what I did, where he actually embraced help and he embraced the community. And seeing what I had gone through and seeing what he went through, I realized how much better it is to let people in and to let them help you, and using that support network around you. And, caregiving can be extremely isolating, even abusive. And in my case, Russ was extremely verbally abusive, and it made it really difficult to let people in because you don't want to expose that. I think dementia often comes with a lot of shame because, I knew that Russ was losing his capabilities, and I knew that was hard for him, and I knew he didn't want to see have other people see him that way. And so there's a lot of shame that comes in with that. And then also in the Lyme community, there's shame because everybody tells you this disease doesn't exist and you're crazy. And so letting people in can be hard, but I think that it's one of the things that you have to get good at, because otherwise it can just be crushing. And by not asking for help, I got to the point where I literally almost broke as part of this process. And it would have been way easier if I had just let people in and let them help me. So what I would say is sit down and catalog the things that you do on a regular basis. And that can be everything. It's not just caregiving. You can be providing care not only for your person who's ill, but you have all sorts of other responsibilities. What can you take off your plate? How can you take some of that and get a little bit of assistance from someone who cares about you and wants to help? And get creative. There's so many different apps to help. I mentioned my symptom tracker, and there's others that are out there. There's also a meal train that you can set up and have other people, bring you dinners. There's lots of helping hands, which is another one where you can, use a community to do all sorts of random tasks and things that might be hard to do on an individual basis, but on an app, people can easily sign up. There's remote patient monitoring, medication management apps. There's all sorts of technology out there that can help you. And so I would encourage you to get creative and get a little vulnerable and ask for help. And then the other thing is really practicing self-care. Everybody hears this, but it's really true. You can't take care of anyone else if you don't take care of yourself. And Eric already referenced this quote, which I took from an Alzheimer's book that I read, but I think it applies to all chronic illness. And so I modified it here. And it says that each case of chronic illness makes two patients, the person affected and the caregiver. And I felt this deeply as part of our journey. I mean, I literally felt like I was losing myself and who I was as a core. And I was unable to become, the mother that I wanted to be to my children because it was just that hard of a job. And, there's lots of tools. Some of them I did well, others, I'm still working on incorporating. I think most importantly was, controlling stress and mood. I've become a huge fan of meditation and incorporate that in daily. I also use techniques like essential oils. I remember when Russ was verbally abusive, instead of engaging and fighting, which is so easy to do with someone who's in your face and yelling, I would just go into the bedroom and smell lavender and just sit there and breathing in and breathing out and trying to reset my mindset. And that helped me kind of get into a different headspace. And now as part of my healing journey, I've become big into somatic breath work. I've started that recently, and I realized how it's helping to unearth a lot of the suppressed feelings and a lot of the suppressed emotions that occurred as being a caregiver. So whatever technique that works for you, I would encourage you to find something that allows you to kind of manage the stress that comes along with it. Don't just stuff it. Find a way to calm yourself and to get it out. The next thing was ruminating thoughts. As I mentioned, I constantly had stuff going around in my head. I'm not good enough. I'm not doing enough. I could be doing more. I'm failing, all sorts of stuff. I mean, as you know, Russ's story didn't end well. And so there was lots of opportunity for me to beat myself up about how I wasn't doing things properly. And so there, the most helpful thing for me was journaling. That was when I started writing again, is I picked up a pencil and I realized that the loops in my head, if I put them out and I put them on the page, the loops stopped. It gave them a place to go. And so I was able to write and to get that emotion out, and that helped me cope in so many ways. And those journal entries ended up becoming the basis for my book. And it was so healing and so helpful. And I was able to go back to them and then use that as part of my healing journey to really understand what I had been through and understand how to go ahead and heal afterwards. Support and advice, that is huge. I mean, support groups, PA Lyme has support groups that you can utilize. In my case, I had a core group of friends that were there for me and that were always checking in, not checking in on Russ, but checking in on me and how I was doing and what help I needed. And that was really helpful, to me, to just know that there was someone that had my back, because I had so many other people's back and I was always putting myself 8th or 9th on the total, 8th or 9th in my list of importance. And so knowing that somebody was checking in on me was important. And then also health management. So about halfway through my journey with caregiving, I started seeing a functional practitioner for me. I realized that the stress was starting to become overwhelming, and they were able to help me make different lifestyle choices, and they gave me adaptogens and other things that helped to control my stress, and just looked at my hormones and how I could balance, and gave me the tools and supplements that I needed in order to help me on a daily basis. And so that's really critical, because it really does make two patients, especially when you've been on this journey for a while. Chronic illness is a marathon, it's not a sprint. And so you need to make sure that you're taking care of yourself so that you don't end up falling victim to the whole process. And so that's really a lot of the crux of what I learned along the way. I think in terms of where we go from here and key takeaways, I would say, it's really just trying to take control of the whole caregiving process. And by doing that, by saying that, I mean, first shift that paradigm. Getting well takes work, and chronic disease does not come with quick fixes, and doctors don't have all the answers. And so you have to shift the paradigm and become an active part of the process. Don't be passive, be active, and really try and partner with doctors to get well and to help be part of that process. And if you don't have a doctor that's working with you, then find another doctor, because I had to do that in order to get anywhere close to getting, Russ on the right path. The second is well, I guess I already touched on it, but taking ownership. Find the doctor who will work with you on your goals and understand and listen to you in your journey. Because, going back to listening to my gut, the first two things I thought of ended up being the most critical things in Russ's case. So often as people who are ill or caregivers of those who are ill, we know what's wrong, but we discount it and we don't trust our gut. And so, you're the expert, take that advice and then start collecting all the information that you do have and give it to the doctors in a way that they can digest it. And then also track and communicate. That's the key to any successful project, and caregiving is a project, and it's definitely something that deserves that attention. And so monitor your successes and failures, summarize your findings and communicate it with the doctor, and then follow your trends and figure out what's working for you and what's not. Because the faster that you figure that out, the faster you're going to be on your healing journey. And then throughout the whole process, take care of you, because if you can't be at your best self, then you're not going to be able to help anyone. And most importantly, give yourself grace. I mean, I have to say it's hard, and I felt like a failure at many points during our journey because it is so hard. And, as I had said, Russ didn't get well. And so it's a very difficult journey. And I blamed myself for so long. And, and I've realized with a little bit of distance from the situation that was unfair. And I realized how hard I was on myself. And I needed to just do my best and to support him in any way that I could. And give yourself grace, because it's a hard job. It's the hardest one that I've ever done. And I know that you'll get through it, and, you need to be kind to yourself in the process. So with that, I would say thank you. And I guess if there's any questions, then we can take it from there.
Well, thank you so much for sharing that, Nicole. That's, I don't know what to say. It's quite a story. And thanks for being a caregiver. We do have some questions coming in. If anybody has a question they'd like to ask, go ahead and use the Q&A feature in Zoom, or you can use the comments. If you're watching on Facebook Live, you can just comment on the video. But I'll start us off with some questions. First question, were you able to find a psychologist or a psychiatrist that was Lyme literate? If so, how did you go about finding that person?
Yeah, that's a great question. And we did not. So we were dealing primarily with functional medicine practitioners. We had a little bit of foray into that, but it wasn't a major part of the treatment. It probably should have been, but it was fast and furious, and was never able to find someone that could help with that part of the journey, because Russ did have a lot of psychological symptoms. He was hallucinating. He had massive anxiety. I mean, anyone who has firsthand experience with Bartonella understands how nasty that bug can be. And he had a lot of symptoms associated with that, but we did not work with anyone in the psychology field.
Okay. Next question. What if your loved one is getting early dementia? You see that sometimes you have to override their decisions, but they are used to being the leader and they don't like having their decisions second guessed. And that person's just kind of getting nasty. That's paraphrasing the question, but that's the.
Yeah, this is hard. I mean, that was Russ, essentially. He was a very high-powered, very smart executive. And the first several months of me realizing he was sick was me then trying to convince him that he was sick. And he thought every doctor's appointment we would go to, he would say, well, she's the one that thinks something's wrong, and she's the reason we're here. And it becomes really difficult. And I think that the way that I ended up getting through was, there were times when he was really nasty, and there were times when he was really combative, and that wasn't the time to really bring up the discussion. It was the more vulnerable moments, which frankly were often followed by the really combative moments. So it's kind of a difficult thing to navigate. You just have to know your loved one. But in the times when he was open, I was able to make some headway and get him to agree to go to doctors. I would say that, one trick that I learned later in the game was, when you are dealing with doctors, when you have somebody that has that combative personality, writing up an email and sending it in advance is a huge help. Because one of the biggest problems that I had when I went to doctors is I have to sit there as the caregiver. He's saying, there's nothing wrong with me. She's the problem. She thinks something's wrong. And then I would have to sit there at the doctor and say, he's forgetting his keys. He takes things out of the dishwasher and can't remember if he just washed it, or if it's dirty and it needs to go in. Like, I would have to explain all of his deficiencies in front of him. And then he got even more angry because then he wants to argue. And so writing everything down and asking the doctor to read it in advance was hugely helpful, not only for the doctor and for me, but also for Russ, because then he wasn't sitting there and hearing how screwed up he was, over and over again. It was just something that we could go through. And I kind of would coach the doctors after we went through a couple of dicey situations. I'd be like, let's just focus on how to get better, and let's focus on the symptoms. And we would talk about the better part rather than the symptomology. And so that summary can be really, really helpful in engaging and kind of avoiding that combative behavior.
Yeah, that sounds like good advice. The next question is, as a caregiver, I often felt invisible. I'm still working on it. And have you discovered any ways to find yourself again and heal?
Yeah, I think meditation has been huge for me. And as I mentioned, somatic breath work has been really eye-opening. This is something I probably can't speak as educated as I would like to, because it's new to me. But I am finding it is unearthing all sorts of emotions and feelings every time I do it that feels healthy. And at the end of the day, I feel like I'm progressing. And so I think, it's those quiet moments. As a caregiver, you're constantly moving. I mean, I had 2 young children. I was working, I was managing the house, and I had a full-time dementia patient that I was caring for at one time. And so you never get to do anything for yourself, and you never get to sit. And so one of the things I've tried to embrace actually came from a friend of mine who I asked her about growth, great growth opportunities. And the word that she used, it just stopped me in my tracks. It was stillness. It was stillness. It was like learning how to be still again after being a caregiver for so long, was like relearning how to relax and how to just be. And that has been, and still is, frankly, a journey that I'm on. So, but I think that meditation and breath work and, also those things have been really helpful in my path.
Okay, the next question is about your children. How did you prepare your children to understand and or cope with what was happening to their father?
As best I could. I mean, I tried to always be honest with them and share what was going on, but at the same time, I tried to shelter them from a lot of it. I wasn't able to have friends over. I would shuffle them off on play dates. When he would get angry, we would kind of go to a different part of the house. So as much as possible, I tried to get them to not see a lot of the really nasty stuff. And then as things happened, I just sat down and talked to them about it, and kind of told them that Dad was sick and that this isn't who he is. And it's not who, even though Dad got really angry, it wasn't something that was who he was. And it wasn't anything that he could control. And it didn't mean that that's the way we should act, because that's not who he is. And so as much as possible, I just tried to be open and honest with them, and then encourage discussion and, make sure that they understood. I guess, fortunately and unfortunately, they were young. And so they've, been able to assimilate and bounce back. And I think they're doing really well, but it's definitely a journey. And I think the biggest thing I have to make sure is that I heal so that I can be the best possible parent for them.
Okay. Have a question about your symptom tracker. Is it an app, a web-based symptom tracker? Is it free? Those kind of questions, if you could expand on it.
Yeah, it's an app that I use on my phone. It is free. There's probably a paid version, but I didn't use it. And yeah, I just would download it on my phone and configure. The thing that I liked about it is that it wasn't prescriptive. You could really track anything that you wanted, and you could write in whichever symptoms and how you wanted to rate them. And then you could track it anytime you wanted. The key to me was having it on the phone, because the phone was usually always with me. And there were so many times, life was so insane. I couldn't even count on myself. I was always a person that I never wrote down lists. I could always keep things in my head. But when I became a caregiver, that just went out the window. And so I couldn't rely upon myself to be able to, remember it and then sit down later at the computer and do it. So having it on my phone right there, I would see something and I would just very quickly put it into my phone, even if it was just a note that I expanded on later, it was there. And so that was really the key. And then at the end of it, when you do sit down and you go look for trends, there's reporting functions and other, types of features you can use to print all of that results out that helps you when you go through and you try and mine it for information.
Okay, next question. So Eric and I, and all of us at PA Lyme, we're very familiar with support groups and what they offer. How about for caregivers? Is there some sort of source or website or something that brings caregivers together that they could get help and support?
I wish I had a better answer for that. I don't know. I never actively engaged in a caregiver support group, mainly because at the time I couldn't leave the house because, Russ couldn't be left on his own. So for me, my personal support group was a group of friends. I had my family members, I had a couple of friends that I enlisted to really know the ins and outs. At first, I was resistant to sharing, but when it became clear that I needed to get that support, I kind of deliberately said, okay, these are my people and I'm going to share and I'm going to be vulnerable. And then they were part of that journey with me. But in terms of websites for caregivers, that's a good question, but I don't have a ready-made answer to that. I know there are in the Alzheimer's community, there's lots of them, but in the Lyme community, I'm not aware.
Okay, if anybody else has questions, let me check Facebook one more time. I always miss the comments on Facebook. Okay, I don't see anything. So we're out of questions at this time. Eric, do you have anything you want to add right now?
No. Nicole, excellent job. Thank you. I'm looking forward to viewing this again and to be able to view your presentation. That's going to be a good thing. So for those that are watching, this is going to be on our website in a couple of days. It's going to be an excellent resource. So this will be our last Virtual Lyme Impact session for 2021. We do not do one in December over the holidays, and we're going to start up again in January. I have a suspicion that a lot of the monthly face-to-face meetings are going to start up again next year. Each of the 18 support groups are run by, an independent regional support group leader who's really going to make their own decision if they're going to be holding monthly meetings, still doing Zoom, still doing or scheduled to do face-to-face. So stay tuned. I think as we slowly or hopefully as we do wean ourselves away from COVID and we start to get our footing again into what, normal is, I think we'll be going back to more of the monthly in-person types of meetings. So stay tuned. We definitely are going to have in January, the third Tuesday of the month, we're going to have a kickoff 2022 virtual Lyme session, which is going to be a real good one. We're we're buttoning up the hatches right now and really making final decisions on the speakers and how this will be rolled out. So do stay tuned. Nicole, again, thank you very much. Really appreciate what you bring to the table. So sorry to hear, but thank you. Thank you for, having the presence and really the compassion to want to use your experience to help others. I don't know what percentage of those that go through this say that and actually, want to be on the board, want to do Lyme advocacy, want to work towards Lyme legislation, want to work towards Lyme research, want to position themselves to help others. But you really are in a good club with all of us that feel that way. So thank you very much. And we look forward to talking again in the future.
I've got one thing to add before we end. Somebody has posted an organization called Families for Joy. Families for Joy offers a weekly Lyme caretaker support group on Thursdays and Saturdays. So
Great.
That's excellent. Families for Joy, huh?
Yep.
And that's Facebook.
I'm not, it doesn't say if it's Facebook or not. I'm not sure what it is, but
That's fine.
we'll have to figure it out. Yeah.
It'll happen, I'm sure. So, okay, well, very good. Bill, hey, thank you very much. Good night, everybody. Good night, Nicole.
Thank
Good night.
you.